Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.
This episode is sponsored by Smile Brilliant.
If you're like me, Catherine, you're a bit overwhelmed by all of the teeth whitening products on the market, and our sponsor, Smile Brilliant, has provided us with some very interesting facts that we would like to pass on to you.
Fact number 1. Teeth whitening doesn't whiten your teeth. It removes stains and restores the tooth to its natural color, which might vary per person, but for most it's an off-white or a slightly yellowish undertone.
Fact 2. Teeth whitening does not damage teeth, but it does temporarily dehydrate. When dehydrated, the pores in the enamel are open and exposed. Open pores invite acids and sugars, which, as we all know, lead to tooth decay. Avoid or minimize acidic and sugary substances for at least 24 hours after whitening. Also, avoid staining substances, as the teeth are more susceptible to restaining during this period.
Fact 3. Tooth sensitivity is the result of tooth dehydration. When the pores of the enamel are open, the teeth become dehydrated, exposing nerves to the elements. As the tooth rehydrates, the sensitivity dissipates. To accelerate the rehydration and curb sensitivity, use a post-whitening application known as remineralization or desensitizing gel.
Fact 4. Caps and veneers cannot be whitened because they do not have pores for the stains to latch onto. So prior to having dental work, you should whiten your teeth, restoring them to their natural color, as the dentist will be color matching to your current shade.
Fact 5. The key to teeth whitening is the delivery device. So long as a whitening product is a peroxide-based whitener, it will remove the stains. What differentiates one product from the other is the device that holds the whitening agent to the tooth without interruption.
Whitening strips neglect the crevices and molars, and they slide on your teeth.
Saliva floods the generic trays because they are bulky and they do not create a seal. And you likely did not know this, but LED lights are novelty items that add no benefit. You need a high-output UV light found only at the dentist. Don't fall for the gimmick. If you insist on a light that doesn't work, get one on Amazon for under $5.
The #1 whitening device recommended by dentists is the custom-fitted tray. You can have your dentist make your trays for $300 to $600, or you can head on over to www.smilebrilliant.com and use their Lab Direct mail-in process for a fraction of the price you would pay at the dentist. Oh, and if you grind your teeth at night, you can also purchase Smile Brilliant's custom-fitted night guards. Once again, for a fraction of the price the dentists charge. Once again, that's www.smilebrilliant.com and use coupon code Agatha, Agatha, you all know how to spell it, for an exclusive All About Agatha discount. Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Broback.
And in this episode, we are covering a Poirot novel. Catherine, what will we be discussing?
We are discussing Third Girl. And just to be clear, not the Third Girl, just Third Girl.
Although the Suchet adaptation, for some reason, saw fit to add that article and their title. I was very irked by that, because I think it's very stylish, actually. Just Third Girl. I can imagine,
I kind of like it.
I can imagine a cool cat from the 60s just kind of snapping his or her fingers and saying, Third girl. That's kind of the vibe of this mystery, isn't it? It's a very 60s Christie mystery.
It's the intended vibe. Let's put it that way. I mean, if I had to read another paragraph talking about Purple Hearts, but we'll get there.
Oh, we will get to the Purple Hearts and the Emerald Dreams. Oh, yes, we will. All right. Before we do, though, perhaps we should talk a little bit about the publication history.
Yeah. So it was published by Collins Crime in November of 1966 in the UK and Dodd Mead in the US in 1967. But it was also serialized in Red Book in the US in 1967. When did we last see a serialized novel, Kemper?
I believe actually the last novel was serialized. At Bertram's Hotel was in fact serialized, but a few of the ones before that had not been. So I just always love when there is a serialization because you know that means that Christie made bank up front.
Right.
But, at this point, let's just say it wasn't much of a gamble that she was going to, make back her advance on a book and reap, the royalties. So I don't think she was quite counting on the upfront payment of these serializations by this point as she was in the 20s and maybe even the early 30s. But yeah, I love a good serialization. And actually, I have a fun fact as to the publication history.
Ooh, okay.
This is coming from our good friend Mark Aldridge. Who else would it be coming from? In his new book, Agatha Christie's Poirot, the greatest detective in the world. And this is what he writes. Poirot's first appearance in a new Collins publication during 1966 was not Third Girl, but in a special collection of Christie short stories called 13 for Luck. And that is with an exclamation point, if you didn't hear that in my delivery there. And I've actually been wanting to talk about this collection for some time, so I'm very happy that that time is upon us now.
Oh, well, we like to make you happy over here, Kemper.
So here's the deal with 13 for Luck. As Mark writes, the volume was aimed at younger readers and featured a variety of stories, mostly of good quality, and including the Market Basing Mystery, a 1923 Poirot adventure that was making its debut in a British book collection. And that, of course, was reworked into the novella Murder in the Mews, which had been published in the 30s. That is how most people have come across that story. Mark continues, despite its apparent innocuousness, Christie was very unhappy that the book was released without proper consultation and objected to its advertised focus on non-adult readers, as well as the presence of stories from the Labors of Hercules, which she did not like to see published independently. And now this is quoting from a letter that she wrote to Edmund Cork, and you know how she liked to write angry letters to Edmund Cork.
She really did.
She really did, and I love quoting from them. I also hate the silly teenagers business, she protested to Cork. Several people came up to me in the States and said, I believe you were writing specially for teenagers now. It is not true. I say so to everyone. My books are written for adults and always have been. I don't believe you realize in the least how much I mind having things slipped over on me. I hate the publishing of 13 for Luck. Just when Third Girl ought to have had the field to itself. 13 for Luck is a very bad title to choose. And the stories in 13 for Luck I never would have agreed to. You've got to keep a beady, firm eye on Collins. I don't trust them. And then, as Mark writes, a self-aware Christie then asked herself, now then, any other complaints, Agatha? Yes. Before then going on into another problem for poor Edmund Cork to have to try to solve. Wow, she was really mad.
I love it. I am so here for that. I'm going to just say I had a little bit of like a rough last week and a half. As you know, Kemper, our listeners hopefully don't, but she's just like really capturing my real vibe right now.
Right. I just also think it's funny because YA is such a robust, I wouldn't even call it genre, of literature at this point. And it's just funny because you could tell that she was like, I don't want to be shunted into books for younger readers. And it's just, that is so not how the field is these days. And it just was also, I think, an interesting portrayal of what the book landscape was around then, 50 years ago, right? Compared to now.
Right, absolutely. Although, I would say that there are plenty of good young reader books or great young reader books that are coming out really around this same time. It's not quite the same year, but I read during lockdown, I read from the Mixed Up Files, which I hadn't read in years, which would have come out around the same time, though, or close to.
Oh, absolutely. The Outsiders, right, is...
Yeah, like about 1970 or about the same time there too. But From the Mixed Up Files is 1967, so same year. And I would say that having, again, reread it within the last 6 months, totally holds up. It's as every bit as great as you remember it being like when you were a kid. And so there's no reason to insult YA.
No, and that's the thing. I mean, I think if Christie were living now, her stance would be quite different. And it's ironic also given the fact, as we've talked at great length on this podcast, that many children do, in fact, read Christie and read it closely and perhaps even listen to this very podcast. We've heard from many of you and, use that as a bridge to other literature, but also not as a bridge, just as becoming Christie fans for the rest of their lives, which is very much what we did. So there really is a place for young readers in Christie.
Yeah,
and it's interesting that she had that reaction.
We probably started reading Christie when we were 10.
Yeah. No, I get why they did this collection and why they wanted to, but hey, they should have asked her before they put it out. Obviously. And again, her vibes just speak to me right now. Yeah. I also just want to give a little extra plug to Mark's book as well, because he does include a lot of book covers in his book. It's part of the fun of flipping through it. And there are some early covers for this book, all of which feature peacocks on them, which
it's really weird and surprising, isn't it?
They're beautiful though, and that's really fun. That's a really fun reference, which I really appreciate. We'll get into that very shortly. I do also, just as we're talking about provenance and placing this within the context of Christie's greater oeuvre, we should note that the third girl living situation, which we will also get into, was briefly mentioned in the Clocks, actually. So this is something that she seems to have been toying with for a bit. But I suppose it's time to get into the meat of things here and talk about our victims.
All right. So we have Louise Charpentier, or Louise Carpenter. She just fancied it up.
Giving herself airs.
Yeah. Who is a 40-something-year-old lady. She had been the former mistress of a man named Andrew Restorick, who we'll get to shortly. And she either has offed herself or was pushed out an upper story window of her flat before the events of the novel.
Right. Then our second victim is David Baker, and he is a very capital R romantic artiste and the paramour of Norma Restorick and perhaps others within this story. We will talk a whole lot more about him. And he is stabbed to death in Norma's flat very late in the story.
He does like a good velvet jacket, though.
Yeah, no, I mean, his look has sort of survived down through the ages, which is something that Poirot actually comments on more than once, that he looks like an old school cavalier. You could also imagine him in Van Dyck painting, right?
Did you see Timothée Chalamet at Cannes? I kind of was thinking about Timothée Chalamet when I was reading about David Baker and was like, Timothée Chalamet kind of is using this look.
Yeah, the flowing locks and whatnot. Rufus Sewell also did this a little bit, which I think we talked about actually in our Pale Horse episode, because we were reminiscing about him in the adaptation of Middlemarch, where he plays Will Ladislaw, and he definitely also captures this capital R romantic look, this heavy-lidded, sort of highly sexualized.
Well, I think I will say I believe that you were reminiscing about him in Middlemarch, which I do appreciate, but I was reminiscing about him in Cold Comfort Farm.
Right. Yes.
Where he's actually just totally sweaty.
But yes, this would also be our peacock, because that is the nickname that Mrs. Oliver gives for him for fairly obvious reasons at this point. So those are our victims. Let's talk about our suspects. First up, and very much suspect number one, front and center. She is presented as the possible, if not probable, murderer by herself, pretty much on page one. That would be Norma Restorick, titular third girl, or is she? She seems to be the titular third girl. She is also described as an Ophelia devoid of physical attraction, which might be the sickest burn I've heard in all of Christie.
Because also, here's the question. Doesn't an Ophelia have to kind of have some physical attraction?
Well, he says that to Mrs. Oliver, and she's like, I know exactly what you mean. And I think it's all of Ophelia's worst qualities and none of her good qualities. And sadly, it seems that Poirot thinks her best quality is that she's attractive, that she's physically attractive, which, I mean, that may be a fair statement depending on one's view of Ophelia and Hamlet, but it's all of the kind of the droopiness and the sad girl thing that she has going on. She's captured all of that, but with none of the charm that Ophelia seems to have, at least in the beginning of Hamlet.
Oh, she just seems like a lank-haired sad sack. It's like, basically, she's like a drowned Ophelia.
I know, which I also feel like was maybe an oblique reference to the pre-Raphaelite, to the Malay right, painting, because like that's how everyone thinks of her, and that's fair since she is, of course, literally drowned in a very visually arresting way in the course of the play. But we can get into it just right now for a second, but there's a lot of physical description of really both Norma and David, and I think the thing that's weird is that the descriptions of them are extremely specific, but they also establish them as types. And they're types that we've seen Christie notice in several books before. I mean, all the way back to The Pale Horse, which is actually at this point 5 years earlier in the canon. She was talking about teddy boys. And David is nothing if not a teddy boy. He's dressing in the fancy clothes. This is a type that we've seen now time and time again in Christie's books. And also in The Pale Horse, there's that extended musing early on in the book about how dirty these modern girls look and how I wish that they would just take a bath. This is what Poirot thinks when he first sees Norma Restorick. His visitor was a girl, perhaps 20-odd, long straggly hair of indeterminate color straight over her shoulders. Her eyes, which were large, bore a vacant expression and were of a greenish blue. She wore what were presumably the chosen clothes of her generation: black high leather boots, white open-work woolen stockings of doubtful cleanliness, a skimpy skirt, and a long and sloppy pullover of heavy wool. Anyone of Poirot's age and generation would have had only one desire: to drop the girl into a bath as soon as possible. He had often felt the same reaction walking along the streets. There were hundreds of girls looking exactly the same. They all looked dirty, and yet, a contradiction in terms, this one had the look of having been recently drowned and pulled out of a river, like Ophelia. Such girls, he reflected, were not perhaps really dirty. They merely took enormous care and pains to look so. I mean, that's a fantastic description, and yet it's setting her up from the get-go as a type so that she's a little hard to grasp as a character. I never really found myself fully grasping or grokking Norma Restorick, and perhaps that was purposeful, but it was a little frustrating.
Yeah, totally agreed. She's enigmatic in a not good way, I'd say.
Fast forward if you haven't read At Bertram's Hotel, which we obviously just covered, but we had a little bit of the same problem with Elvira Blake, right? In At Bertram's Hotel. But she's the murderer. And like, that is a very common problem with murderers in murder mysteries, in Christie mysteries and other murder mysteries, where there's that distance, right, between the reader and the murderer, because sometimes you can't get to know him or her all that well. Spoiler, we already know that David Baker is not the murderer. Norma doesn't turn out to be the murderer either. So I find it a lot more problematic because they're actually two of the biggest victims in this book. And the book is very much preoccupied with that. I mean, David is literally murdered, and Norma, as we'll find out, is also herself very much victimized, even though she's not murdered. So it's a big issue, I think, with this book, and why this book doesn't do so well on character, as Christie often does.
Speaking of additional characters, we should go to Andrew Restorick, who's Norma's father, who has been off accumulating like vast wealth in South Africa. And he has not seen Norma since she was about 5 years old. So he's only been back in like the last few years.
Right. So then we have Andrew Restorick's wife. This would be his second wife. So not Norma's mother. This is her stepmother. She is Mary Restorick, a conservatively dressed blonde gardener type. She's from South Africa, and she's got really elaborate hair. Very elaborate hair. We'll leave it at that for now.
And then we are listing him as a suspect because, in fact, he is guilty of a crime. We'll put it that way. But David Baker again. So even though we named him as a victim, he is made out to be a suspect, and definitely is for the majority of the book.
Yes, he is indeed. Wearing a black coat, an elaborate velvet waistcoat, skin-tight pants, and rich curls of chestnut hair that hung down on his neck. He looked exotic and rather beautiful, and it needed a few moments to be certain of his sex. Interesting. Poirot is quite taken, actually, with his appearance. I think that this is one of those cases where I remember actually our friend Jamie Berntal talking about how some critics claim that as Christie grew older, that she got quote unquote confused and she would start giving Poirot opinions that were actually hers, especially when he started mooning over young men. That's ridiculous. I think that Christie's not confused. She's not that confused anyway. And I think it's interesting. And I think that Poirot actually has always appreciated beauty and youth, no matter the sex. That is very much the youth and the beauty that's on display in this book, David Baker as the Peacock.
Yeah, if you actually think about it, we don't get that many young men as heroes in Christie. Do you know?
There's a lot of, it kind of dates back to, I think, when she was young and went to Egypt, and she had her coming out in Cairo and she would dance with those older colonel types.
Yeah.
And I think she often really liked the notion of, being young and sort of being swept away by an older, more experienced man. And, we know that the age differential in the other direction with her second husband was not something that she liked to really joke about, or, that she got over it, obviously, but, she wasn't super comfortable with it. And it was a little bit of a barrier at first to their getting together. So, yeah, perhaps that's why. I agree. I think that's also it's kind of like a Western cultural bias, right? That we often, I think, exalt beautiful youth in women, but not as much in men because of that, because we're, the men are supposed to be the protectors and the experienced ones, et cetera, et cetera. But it's interesting and it's kind of nice. And perhaps in some way, it does extend from the fact that, and Poirot is making this point, it's very much it's Christie's point, but I believe it coming from Poirot, that the appreciation of a classical beauty is something that he's always had. And given the way that girls have chosen to look, or young women have chosen to look in 1966, 67, the classical beauty is not there so much. But given the way that the men have chosen to look, the young men, a la David Baker, looking as if they could be from the 17th century, there is a lot of classical beauty there to their appearance. So that's why it's sort of appreciated and focused on a lot more than the women might have been in the 20s or the 30s, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Not to interrupt that lovely analysis, but we do have some more suspects.
We do. This is the longest listing of suspects ever. I apologize.
I think
my tangents.
You're gonna find out later, I think, why there might be those tangents. But so we have Sir Roderick Horsfield, who's Norma's uncle, who is a military man. He is getting a little bit dotty in his old age, and I think it's really funny because I think actually when I went back to double check, I think he's 60 something, and I was like, oh no.
Well, I think he's her great uncle, I think, at least, but yeah, he's not
that old. I was reading him as he was Methuselah,
right, yeah, pushing 100, yeah,
no. And then it was oh no, he's 65.
So then we have Sonia, who is Sir Roderick's private secretary, and she is soft-spoken, she is foreign, she's not English. It's not quite clear where she hails from. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And she may or may not be a spy. Oh, yes, we might have some espionage hijinks afoot here.
Yeah, unfortunately. But then we have Claudia Reese Holland, who's Norma's flatmate. She would be the first girl in this equation. It's her flat. And she's the secretary to Andrew, and she's the daughter of an MP.
And then we have Frances Carey, and she is the second girl in the flat. She is a gallerina. She works in a gallery. She's very chic and very artistic as well. She has sort of long, sweeping black hair and
it's
white
always in
makeup.
Her face, by the way.
Always in her face. The hair is always in her face. She's got white makeup and lots of mascara. Just super, super emo going on here. We've seen this character before, actually, in earlier Christie's in the 30s when, hey, that was a look. And you know what? Still a look now in the 60s. 60s. And just to, perhaps state the obvious, that whole first girl, second girl, third girl thing, this is as to an apartment share. So they're all living in a flat in London, and the lease is under Claudia Reese Holland's name. And then she brought in Frances Carey to split the rent. And then because the rent is so high and it's so easy because it's the 60s, the swinging 60s for single women to live together, they brought in a third girl. And that's how it was advertised. So you can imagine the elderly Christie looking at newspaper adverts for third girls and being like, interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the world as it appears to be, Catherine.
Poirot's at breakfast in his flat, per usual. He's finishing his book on fictional detectives, which we've heard about before.
Oh, have we, Catherine? Yes, we heard about that in The Clocks, actually, because remember, he was working on that tome. And I just have to pull out one quote because...
is it going to be the Wilkie Collins shade?
Yes, you know me. Yeah. You know me so well,
I
Catherine.
know you so well.
This is what Christie writes. He had finished his magnum opus, an analysis of great writers of detective fiction. He had dared to speak scathingly of Edgar Allan Poe. He had complained of lack of method in the romantic outpourings of Wilkie Collins, had lauded to the skies two American authors who were practically unknown, and had in various other ways given honor where honor was due, and sternly withheld it where he considered it was not. He also, by the way, gets really annoyed at a whole bunch of printer's errors, which very much feels like Christie airing her own personal grievance. But how dare he malign Wilkie Collins?
I just have to say, I know. I just read that and I was like, well, Kemper is not going to like this book.
You were like, I'm going to be hearing about that.
Definitely made a mental note, my love. Clearly going to come up. But so he's doing this and he's disturbed by Georges, which I had never really noticed this before. I don't know if you noticed it particularly before either, Kemper. I don't think we've commented on it, but how Georges is called obviously Georges by Poirot, but then it's spelled George in stuff that isn't dialogue. I had really never noticed that before, frankly.
She's mainly consistent about that. There was an earlier book in which he's referred to as Georges with the S in the narration, but usually he's Georges to Poirot only in dialogue and George in narration because he's English.
Right.
But yeah, there is a difference there. And I think it's a little all over the place in this very book as well.
I think it is too. Yeah. So I was kind of trying to track it, and then I just gave up in this. But I noticed it more here in this book than I had in other ones. But he comes in, he bothers Poirot. Poirot's unhappy about being bothered, and basically what Georges says is that there is a very distressed young woman who pretty much seems to be on drugs and says that she's murdered somebody.
Well, she says she thinks she's murdered someone. She's not sure.
Right. And she won't give her name and she won't sit down, which is interesting. None of the young people sit down. I think later in the book, David Baker won't sit down either.
Well, they're all hopped up on drugs, basically. It's what's happening. I think that's what we're supposed to glean from that. But I'll give it this. It's a great hook. It's like Christie really does these gonzo big hooks where she figures out unusual ways to open up mysteries. It's super weird for someone to come in and say, I think I might have murdered someone and I don't know what to do about it. She still got it, you know?
Yeah,
it's
for sure.
Opening.
Well, and then better yet, she says all this while she's just drugged up staring at Poirot. And then she's like, actually, though, you know what? You're an old. And I wasn't aware of that. And because of that, I'm going to peace.
Yeah, I mean, she literally just says you're too old.
To his face.
To his face. And he's, left to do his nom da nom da nom.
I know.
Which I can just hear David Suchet do.
I know. And then, unsurprisingly, he's egregiously offended, right?
He's wounded.
Yes.
That's how he puts it. He is wounded, cut to the quick. So where does he go when he feels so wounded? Well, fortunately, Ariadne Oliver gives him a ring in the aftermath of all this because, you see, she wants to invite him to be a guest speaker at the annual dinner of our Detective Authors Club. So this is Christie's way of obliquely referencing the Detection Club, which, of course, we've spoken about a lot, in particular on our episode interviewing its current president, Martin Edwards. Oh, yes.
I know, it's great.
He has been on this podcast. Very proud of that. Let's just remind ourselves, Christie was a founding member of the club. She served as its president from 1958 until her death in 1976. So she was the president at the time of writing this, but on the understanding that she would never have to make a speech. So she definitely would have turned down Mrs. Oliver's offer if she were Poirot. This is, an opportune phone call because Poirot gets to commiserate with Mrs. Oliver about these young things and, how he can't believe this rude girl who contacted him. And as he's speaking with Mrs. Oliver about all this, because she invites him over and he comes over and, he's drinking chocolate and whatnot. She's actually very kind to him.
Well, by the way, it's also one of the better things is that she has to offer him like 17 different options of what she's going to offer him before he agrees to come over.
Yeah, he's like fussy about coming. And then she says, come and have tea with me. And he says, afternoon tea, I do not drink it. Then you can have coffee. It is not the time of day I usually drink coffee. Chocolate with whipped cream on top or a tisane. You love sipping tisanes or lemonade or orangeade. Or would you like decaffeinated coffee if I can get it? I mean, she's doing her thing, which she usually does with mystery plots, right? Where like she just has a million ideas. She is never at a loss for ideas, Mrs. Oliver. So he basically just says yes to like shut her up.
Although he 100% wants to go over there and complain.
It's actually really sweet. They're, they're friends.
They're 100% friends, even if he kind of doesn't want to admit it. All he wants to do is like go over and complain to her about this rude girl.
And then what's really funny is that as he's complaining about her, Mrs. Oliver is like, interesting.
You can kind of read. She's like, whoops daisies.
She's like, I kind of think I might have been the one to send that rude girl to you. It's a funny scene, but I find it a little irksome that there's this unnecessary coincidence we have to swallow this early in the book. It does not bode well, let's just say, for events to follow, because it would have been the easiest thing in the world for Mrs. Oliver to be calling him up, not to invite him to the detection club, but to say, oh, hey, I'm so curious about that weird girl who I sent your way. What happened with that? The fact that she forgets about it and then he happens to go over and talk to her about it. And then she's like, oh, my God, I'm actually the one who sent her to you because we happen to have met at a party. It's a little bit like, really? It's again part of the great opening of this book. I had no problems with the opening of this book other than that quibble.
Right. Well, Poirot's not pleased about Mrs. Oliver's involvement. Not only has he been called old and then he's commiserated with his old friend, but then he realizes that she's responsible for this girl.
Well, and their curiosity has been piqued. I mean, that's also the funny thing about this whole book. No one is asking them to look into this whatsoever. But basically, Poirot and Mrs. Oliver are like, we need to get to the bottom of this. And it's like, because you're old and bored? Maybe. But that's okay because, hey, there's lots of hijinks happening here with these drug-addled youths. So more than enough to fill the pages of this book. It's just funny that they're doing this very much of their own volition.
Right. So Mrs. Oliver pretty much says that, okay, listen, I'm going to make it up to you. I'm going to set you up with an introduction to Sir Roderick Horsfield down at the family estate. So she does that. And then she also makes up an excuse to go to the flat that the girls are living in. So Poirot goes down to the estate and then he pretends to be a Belgian spy from the war, which is actually, to the credit of this book, the whole sequence is actually somewhat delightful.
Well, he name checks Colonel Race, so,
He does. And then, so Poirot walks out back into the hallway, and Sir Roderick says to Sonia, who's in the room, he goes, I have no clue who that person is.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. And then Mrs. Oliver pretends that Norma actually cared about her mysteries and that she wanted one of her books, that she's delivering it to the flat just to basically
Snoop. She's snooping.
Get her way in there. We, over the course of many pages. And here's where I think we should pause and just note, unfortunately, that especially in early and quite frankly, mid and even up to quite recently within the Christie oeuvre, she runs a tight ship. That's how we like to put it, right? That Christie generally is very efficient with her plotting, but she's also efficient with the fundamentals of writing, and that her dialogue is crisp, her sentences are short, her writing is overall just sparkling and effervescent, and it's a big part of why the pages turn, and it's really hard to do, and it's something that she was good at and just naturally talented at, and it's why we get so annoyed when people say, oh, Christie wasn't really a good writer, but I guess she was good at creating puzzles. It's like, no, she was good at both.
No,
amazing at both.
She was amazing. Yeah, amazing.
I say this all.
This book would not be an example of that.
Yeah, this book is noticeably long-winded, and I think,
it's not. If you're having a bad week and had to read this, which maybe one of us did, let me just say, it's not that long of a book, but boy, does it feel like it.
We were talking about this a little bit before we recorded, actually. And, we know that Christie started using a dictaphone a lot more in her later career. And this one feels a lot more like someone rambling aloud on a dictaphone, quite honestly, than her earlier books. And I have to wonder if she were writing it as she wrote her earlier books, if it wouldn't have gotten trimmed, or if she were perhaps younger and more vigorous and also had editors who were willing to say anything to her. Because at this point, I mean, who's really going to edit Agatha Christie, the institution? And that's really what she was at this point. There's perhaps even an analogy to be made, dare I say, with Harry Potter, which a lot of people talk about, which is the Harry Potter books ballooned after Harry Potter became a phenomenon. And you may like that or not, but regardless of what you think that does to the quality, who was going to say anything to J.K. Rowling and say, no, you need to cut 200 pages. And I think there might have been something similar going on here, because it doesn't really seem like anyone reined her in on this book. And it has a lot of just meanderings that don't feel necessary and that mar the overall quality of the book. The reason why I don't come down as hard on it as I thought I might have after I finished it is that I get more annoyed by unnecessary repetition. And I felt like the clocks in particular, just to point to a recent Poirot, was repetitive and tiresome and tedious in that way. And it's that dragging the marsh thing that we talk about. And we sometimes get that even in the early and the mid-career Christies. This is not repetitive. It's just long-winded and baggy and not efficiently told, which is not great, but it's not repetitive.
But here's the thing, I don't mind a mystery novel that spends an incredibly large amount of time on description and detail. I'm not a reader like that. I actually like those books better, largely.
It has to be done well, though.
Yeah, I would compare it and see if you agree with this or not. But I would say that it's not actually a thriller, but it's getting close tonally to one.
I don't know if I would agree with that. I know what you mean. I think it is just a very loosely constructed puzzle mystery that has a lot of extra bits and pieces that don't tie up at the end, which is very frustrating. So it's a frustrating read, but it's not like at Bertram's Hotel, which was, 90% a thriller, 10% a puzzle mystery. To me, this is a puzzle mystery that's just told, I suppose, in a more thriller-like way as to Christie specifically, because she does get a little looser when she's writing a thriller as opposed to a puzzle mystery. So in that way, I agree with what you're saying. But the novel that it actually reminds me of the most, which I think speaks to why these digressions don't work, is Hickory Dickory Dock. And the reason is just that she's trying something really different here. And I applaud her for that, as I think we always do. And it's important to do that. She said to herself, okay, there's something different happening in London right now and in England and in the world. There's this drugs culture. There are drugs here in a way that there weren't before. And the youth of today act differently from the way they did in my day.
Exactly, much like Hickory Dickory Dock, it has that exact same Steve Buscemi, hello fellow kids vibe to it.
Well, it's her attempting to portray a milieu that she was not a part of and not doing it well because she doesn't capture it because she wasn't a part of it. And I think, as we've seen, she does very well with settings and even, I think, just with overall environments that she is a part of in some way. And she was just too distant from the multicultural young student setting in a hostel in Hickory Dickory Dock to capture it. And she's too far away, I think, from the
Chelsea art crowd.
The Chelsea art crowd. However, we should put this in context with our next novel. I think it's very important to do so while we are criticizing this book, because sometimes she was able to make the leap and portray a setting that she wasn't a part of. And boy, does she do that in Endless Night. So let's not pretend that she can't do it. She just didn't do it all the time. And I think this is an unfortunate example, as was Hickory Dickory Dock, and not as unfortunate as it was in Hickory Dickory Dock. This is not as bad as Hickory Dickory Dock by any means, or as distressing a read.
No, this is much more hello, fellow kids versus kind of offensive.
Right.
Back to the plot, Kemper.
Indeed.
In all of these pages, we learned that Norma's mother died some number of years ago. She hasn't seen her father since she was 5 because he'd run off with a mistress named Louise, which, geez, do we think that Louise might have any relation to the Louise who jumped out a window?
I know. There's a moment where Poirot was like, where have I heard this name Louise before? And I was like screaming at the page, it's the woman who jumped out. I think he's talking about the woman who jumped out the window. So I was like, it's the woman who Andrew Restorick left his wife for. Like, of course it is. Come on. This isn't hard.
No. And so, yeah, he's back in England finally with the second wife, Mary, who we mentioned. And, as we also mentioned, despite being apparently very beautiful, Mary is like very prim and conservative, and there's something super weird with her hair.
I don't think that Mary Restorick's hair falls off in any way. It's just, pretty obviously a wig because it's so big and it's so elaborate. But there is an intense focus on hair in general in the novel.
So there's a runner with Mrs. Oliver's hair because she has all these like weird fake braids in her hair. I wasn't entirely sure what her hairdo was meant to look like, but they're not her actual hair. They're like clip-on extensions.
Well, okay, so you're going to have to forgive me for another little tangent here, Catherine, but trust me, this is going to be worth it, because we know that Mrs. Oliver changes her hairstyle a lot, right? That's like one of her things. Like she likes apples, she writes a lot of mysteries, and she always has different hair.
Right.
In the books, not obviously. Zoe Wanamaker was like, I'm not doing that.
Yes.
And
these were like weird, ugly gray braids that people keep picking up off the floor.
No, so this is I'm going to pull out the quote because it's legitimately funny. It's also, in addition to the opening, the best parts of this book I think involve Poirot and Mrs. Oliver together, or just Mrs. Oliver on her own. So it's worth focusing on them for a little bit. So this is what Christie writes: the last time he had seen Mrs. Oliver, her hairstyle had been plain and severe. It now displayed a richness of coils and twists arranged in intricate patterns all over her head. Its prolific luxury was, he suspected, largely artificial. He debated in his mind how many switches of hair might unexpectedly fall off if Mrs. Oliver was to get suddenly excited, as was her wont. And then just a few pages later, he picks up one of these false coils of hair and, quote, puts it discreetly on the table, which I thought was really funny. And this made me think, Catherine, of 2 sections from Agatha Christie's autobiography, in which she talks about the travails of having long hair as a young lady of the Edwardian era. And I just want to highlight them again. I've actually already quoted from one of these before. I am fully aware of that. I am being a little repetitive myself, but it's well worth it because I think it's so charming and interesting. Because I feel like Christie talking about her hair is a rare example of a person who lived in like a pre-modern time, remembering it with a modern sensibility in a weird way. It's like, because she truly was a young Edwardian woman. Right. So in the first section, she just talks about what it was like to have long hair. And this is what she says. My hair was very long. I could sit on it easily. This, for some reason, was considered something to be proud of in a woman, though what it actually meant was that your hair was completely unmanageable and was always coming down. To counteract this, hairdressers created what was called a postiche, a large false knot of curls with your own hair pinned away as tight to your head as possible, and the postiche pinned to that. Okay. So then a little later, she talks about beginning to attend country house parties as a young girl of 19 or so. So that would be around 1909. And she talks about how she first went to, quote, some friends in Warwickshire, great hunting people. These would be the Ralston Patricks. Ah, yes, they had a double-barreled name. And how one day after she'd, quote, had a gallop round the fields, my hair was not up to the strain. I still wore, as all girls did, the postiche attachment. Riding back down the village street, my hair collapsed completely, and curls dropped off at intervals all the way. I had to go back on foot to pick them up. Unexpectedly, this produced a rather pleasing reaction in my favor. Robin, which would be Robin Ralston Patrick, her host, told me afterwards that one of the leading lights of the Warwickshire hunt had said to him approvingly, nice girl you've got staying with you. I imagine him saying gel. Nice gel you've got staying with you. I like the way she behaved when all that false hair fell off. Didn't mind a bit. Went back and picked it all up and roared with laughter. Good sport she was. The things that made a good impression on people are really very odd. So that's the end of Christie's delightful little section in the autobiography about that. But it made me think of it because then there's this other point in the book, which is when Mrs. Oliver is hanging out in that Chelsea studio with all the hep, cool kids right before she gets conked on the head.
Right.
And a few coils of false hair fall out of her bag and she starts like madly attaching them to her head. And then Peter, who's like the beat artist, he's super dirty and greasy, he, quote, roars with laughter. And I read that and I was like, oh, I feel like there's an echo of her memory from her childhood or her young adulthood there in that, just with that same verb roar. And I remembered that moment from her autobiography. So I wanted to share it with you all.
I like that. My reaction is, and I think I told you this, is that it's very much like Dion in Clueless finding like the weird extension that's in the back of her boyfriend's car and being like, excuse me?
Yeah. Doesn't he try to say like, he's like, oh, that's yours, right?
And then she's like insists.
No.
Yes. She's like, I don't know. It's definitely not.
It's not up to her standard, I believe.
Right. And then she's like very, very indignant about it. And so that was totally what I was reminded of. But Mrs. Oliver does manage to track down Norma, actually, doesn't she, Kemper?
She does.
Kind of by accident. And Norma's dining with David. She also manages to alert Poirot, though.
There's legitimate comedic hijinks there. That's where she changes her hairstyle also. And she talks about how changing her hairstyle completely changes a woman's appearance because hair is the focus of a woman's appearance. And then she puts her reading glasses on to disguise herself. And as she's walking through the restaurant, she literally can't see because she's wearing her reading glasses. I laughed. Like, that's fun. I mean, let's be honest, there's not a huge amount of fun to be had in this book. And I really appreciated that.
And then we get a really weird sequence with somebody who we've never met named Dr. Stillingfleet, who's involved in a conversation with somebody who we don't see, although we've been reading these books long enough that you can assume that it's probably Poirot.
Oh, and Catherine, we have met Dr. Stillingfleet before, actually.
Wait, when did we meet him?
We, I think, can assume that we've met him. We met Dr. Stillingfleet all the way back in a Poirot short story, The Dream, which was first published in 1937. And he seems to be as young and spry as ever here.
30 years later?
30 years later. So I think that he was trapped in the same Walt Disney cryogenic chamber that Jane Hellier was in between Miss Marple short story appearances, because she too seems to, have not aged over several decades. So, all good.
Interesting. I would not have thought that was the same person. I would have thought it was a weird reuse of a name, but sure, I guess maybe he has like time travel abilities or something. Or he's like 80 years old. I mean, also possible, I guess. I don't think we get a particularly good physical description of him, do we?
I know. I think he's described as boyish, sort of. And you know what I got from him? I got a very Tommy vibe from him. Not necessarily handsome, but full of energy, a stand-up guy, and resourceful, going places, just who you want in a pinch. Which is what Poirot, is doing here, because he basically hires him to take in Norma Restorick and just watch over her, since she's essentially just wandering around the streets of London on all sorts of drugs, with this horrible boyfriend who no one trusts and thinks she's killed someone and obviously needs a lot of help. So he has her taken care of in this what seems to be an asylum, right? Or it's at least just like a home.
Like a sanitarium, because she can leave she can leave at will. So
right. And but Poirot also doesn't admit that he's done this to Mrs. Oliver, who just thinks that Norma has disappeared. And there's actually a lot of chatter in this book about what it means for Norma to have disappeared and whether maybe she lost her memory. Again, it's always interesting when Christie is musing about disappearances, especially because, by the way, he's not really going to figure much into our summation, but the Inspector d'Histoire is also someone we have come across before.
Yes, we have.
He was Inspector Neal in A Pocket Full of Rye. He is now Chief Inspector Neal, but Christie very rarely uses the last names of real people to name her characters, but we all know who has the last name Neal. That would be the woman who Archie Christie left Agatha Christie for. And I think it's really interesting that she used him twice. And he too, by the way, there's really no connection made to the Inspector Neal in Pocket Full of Rye, who got a lot of interiority for an Inspector d'Histoire in that book. He's handled very differently in this book. It almost doesn't seem like it's the same character, except he has the same name. It's very similar to the Dr. Stillingfleet situation. So I just thought that that was interesting that he was used in a book which also mused on disappearances and memory loss and whatnot. Where do we go next, Catherine?
Oh, Kemper. Boy, howdy, does this get exhausting. Sir Roderick hires Poirot to find some missing papers that were stolen from him about the war and spying. Poirot discovers that Sonia, who you might remember is Sir Roderick's assistant, it's his secretary, is a spy because she's been seen trading information with known spies in Kew Gardens. She was spotted exchanging papers with, quote, one of the junior attaches of the Herzegovinian embassy. Like real flashback there, Kemper.
Well, but almost a flashback, but not quite, because it should have been the Herzegovinian.
I know.
Embassy, because Herzegovina is a real place. Czechoslovakia, not so much. And it's like, what? Just make it Czechoslovakia. I want my Czechoslovakia reference. It's very odd. The continuity in this book is off. And it kind of goes to the George thing too. You know, again, it feels like this book was written via dictaphone. There's not the same care, perhaps, put into it as we're used to.
It's not even, no, it feels like nobody edited it. That's what it feels like. You know, I don't even know that it's really the fault of the dictaphone. It feels like there are just like continuity problems where it's just like, didn't somebody read this before they published it? Like,
and Collins was like, we'll make like $1 million off of this. It's fine. It doesn't really matter. We joke, but like, and that's sad. It's doing Agatha Christie a disservice, but I'm sure that happens to a certain extent. When you have a sure thing, you don't necessarily have to dot every I and cross every T. It's not necessary. So Mrs. Oliver finds evidence that the former mistress of Andrew Restorick was a woman named Louise Burrell, who, yes, we all have made the connection at this point, is the same Louise who jumped or perhaps was pushed out of a window at the block of apartments where Norma and Claudia and Frances live, Borodine Mansions in London. And Mary Restorick herself has been in hospital on and off because of gastritis. Love a good gastritis flare-up in a Christie. And and Norma is still, quote unquote, missing, even though Poirot has taken care of her, except has he? Because she hasn't been missing so long as she's in that sanitarium with Dr. Stillingfleet. But then she apparently sees a newspaper ad and leaves of her own accord. You know, and he says, I had to let her go because that was the whole deal, that she could go if she wanted to. And he couldn't hold her there against her will. So she leaves, and then she goes back to her own apartment in Borodine Mansions. And she comes upon the dead body of David Baker. And, you know, the way this is blocked, it's unclear whether or not she killed him. She's holding a knife. He has blood all over him. The knife is bloody, and she's convinced that she did it. So, dun, dun, dun. When we get to the end of The World as It Appears to Be, it seems like maybe Norma Restorick was right all along, and she killed Louise Charpentier. She killed David Baker. She's the murderer, and, you know, she's going to be put away in some sort of a home that is a lot less nice than that Dr. Stillingfleet sanitarium for the rest of her years. But fortunately, this is actually an Agatha Christie puzzle mystery, and we have some clues to bridge us on over into the world as it actually is. Clue number 1. Andrew Restorick left England to go seek fortune and glory abroad when he was a relatively young man, right? When his daughter was 5 and he left his first wife. And he specifically went to Africa. He sort of based himself out of South Africa, but he went all over. He had a bit of an itinerant lifestyle, and he talks about how that just suited him more, and he was born in England. And the deduction there is that, just as a general rule, drawing on previous Christies, specifically Hercule Poirot's Christmas in a Pocket Full of Rye, I won't get any more specific than that, so I won't spoil anything. We should be very wary when a character goes off to Africa and makes a successful / swashbuckling go of it, because it just tends to bring complications, big ones. And I think we have a few more clues to that effect.
Clue 2, we should be wary when international travelers disappear a lot. We haven't mentioned Mr. Goby yet. We've seen him before, too.
He's an investigator who Poirot hires from time to time.
Basically, he's an info dump.
When Christie needs to do an info dump late in the novel, she draws on Mr. Goby, which is why he did technically appear in The Mystery of the Blue Train, but then he doesn't appear until a whole bunch of books later on in the canon. We saw him in After the Funeral, and then we'll be seeing him again in Halloween Party and Elephants Can Remember. So more info dumps to come, apparently. And I still stick to the fact that he feels very Dickensian to me. Like, I love how he never looks at the person he's talking to. He looks at a lot of furniture.
Yes,
and he's just like a very weird person. And, we know that Christie loved her Dickens, and I could just so easily see him in like Bleak House or David Copperfield or something like that. He's actually a good character.
So according to him, he says 3 times, I believe, he was reported dead, gone off into the bush and not turned up again, but he always did in the end. 5 or 6 months and he'd pop up in some entirely different place or country. The deduction here is, if somebody keeps disappearing, do you know that it's them when they show back up again?
We should never make assumptions like that in Christie, right?
No. And I think this is related to clue number 3 and clue number 4 and clue number 5.
It is indeed. I mean, but Christie's really layering in a lot of clues here as to identity in a very classic way for her, which is why I love stepping out these clues as much as we are doing. So clue number 3, fast forward if you haven't yet read A Pocket Full of Rye, but when a character who's been abroad talks about selling the family business and going back abroad, that would be Lancelot, a.k.a. Lance Fortescue in A Pocket Full of Rye, our murderer. It's time to get suspicious, as we did of Lance in that book, and as perhaps we should of Andrew Restorick in this book, because he too talks about selling the business, going back abroad. He says he's being approached with various takeover bids, and they can have the whole caboodle on very advantageous terms. He says, I'll take the cash and go back to a country that means something, that's real. So again, this is just making Andrew Restorick more and more suspicious.
Clue number 4, there's a real dearth of photographs. It harkens back to A Murder is Announced. Basically, what Norma says is that all of the old photographs of her father, Andrew, had been thrown away. And you kind of have to figure, especially because keep in mind, this is 1967. People had like point and shoot cameras at this point, everybody would have had piles of photographs. And if there are no photographs of this guy who she hasn't seen since she was 5 years old, again, building on the fact that maybe something is not right here, which also goes to clue number 5, which is that the one image of him that she does have is a painting.
Indeed. Clue number 5, the portrait of Andrew Restorick, which Poirot focuses on so much. It is mentioned so many times, this portrait that he brings from his country house to his office so that he's sitting in front of it when he is taking meetings, and Poirot studies it. We should just note that a portrait is not the same as a photograph. It's obviously easy to paint a portrait of someone and paint a portrait of someone and, perhaps make them look younger so that if you, want to say you're Andrew Restorick, but you're not, you pay someone to paint a picture of you looking younger, and then you put that behind you in your office when you're holding yourself out as Andrew Restorick. That could be a thing that happens. It's just easier to fake things with a portrait, especially in a book that's populated by so many artists. I'm just saying.
Well, not only that, but the portrait is very clearly of a style that is not from 1967. And that's also made very clear.
Yes. So maybe there are artists here who are good at mimicking other artists.
Possibly so.
That might be a thing that struggling young painters who strut around Chelsea like peacocks might do from time to time.
Spoiler, Kemper. Clue number 6, children's memories are malleable. If you're a 5-year-old and you haven't seen your father in, 20 years or whatever, who's to say that you recognize him?
Clue number 7. One of my favorites, hair. So we have one character whose dark draping hair is constantly mentioned. That would be Frances Carey. We have another character whose wig, the fact that she wears one, the fact that it's big and blonde, is constantly mentioned. That would be Mary Restorick. And then we get that whole amusing moment from Ariadne Oliver when she's changing her hairstyle before she goes stumbling around the restaurant. And she's talking about how hair is the focal point of a woman's appearance. We are being very much put on notice here. Christie's playing very fair with the fact that hair can disguise a person, perhaps especially a woman. So we should just be wary of the wig wearer, as always in a Christie novel. That would be Mary Restorick, but also of Frances Carey, who drapes her hair over her face and who makes so much of her hair. What would be clue number 8, Catherine?
Well, I just want to say one other thing about clue number 7 is that I did appreciate that Chief Inspector Neil got very insulted when Poirot brought up the hair to him because apparently his wife wears a wig all the time.
I feel like that's also such a old school thing that people were definitely doing in the 60s when you hadn't gone to the salon. You would wear a wig. Over your hair.
Not that, but I mean, did you watch Hacks on HBO?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Where she has the wig trays because then you can just cut your hair short and just plop the fancy wig on. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's very easy maintenance, right?
I kind of when I was watching Hacks, I was like, maybe I should take that up. Clue number 8, Frances Carey, as we said, she's like a gallerina. She's a, art gallery girl, and she travels a lot. And also Mary Restorick goes into London a lot for shopping. And I think her deduction here might be if you have two characters who really, really like being away from their house, something might be going on there.
Especially when something's up with their hair, both of them.
Right.
All right. So clue number 9, this makes me so happy. We have such a classic here, everyone, because this is Mr. Goby's précis of Frances Carey. And I really did think of you, Catherine. I literally wrote in the margins, Catherine's dream, because it just struck me as, especially the angsty, arty teenage version of you, that this could potentially be your dream resume, because this is how he describes Frances Carey. Was at RADA for a time, then went to the Slade, works for the Wedderburn Gallery, well-known place in Bond Street, specializes in arranging art shows in Manchester, Birmingham, sometimes abroad, goes to Switzerland and Portugal, arty type, and has a lot of friends amongst artists and actors. Ooh la la, what a life.
I think I had that for a few years in my 20s.
Totally. Before you threw it all away and moved out to LA. Yeah, I mean, the key in there is obviously RADA and the actor friends. We have an actress, everyone. There is an actor in the mix.
Intruder alert! Intruder alert! Intruder alert! Intruder alert!
Interesting.
Clue number 10. We know who did it pretty much, but there's a question as to how, and that's really where the drugs come into play because there are so many drugs and all these hep cats listening to their jazz in Chelsea and, to put it another way, emerald dreams, purple hearts, and hemp. Oh my. The number of times those particular quote-unquote drug names are mentioned in this book is not a small number.
It's not. There's so much mention of purple hearts, especially, that is a real thing. It is a real thing.
So, I mean, the deduction here is maybe instead of it just being 1966 and that everybody's doing all the drugs, is it possible that Norma is being drugged And is that why she thinks she murdered Louise Charpentier and David Baker? I mean, that seems like a pretty decent possibility that if you just told somebody who was really high that they murdered somebody, they might believe it.
And then our final clue, clue number 11, and this one I think has echoes of earlier Christie, which is why I wanted to include it, but it's used disappointingly. When you have numbers falling off of doors in a Christie novel, because Mrs. Oliver notes that the door to Norma and Claudia and Francis's flat, like the numbers keep falling off. They're in number 67 Borodin mansions. And it's also noted that Louise Charpentier lives in flat number 76. We learn that, you know, the reason why Norma thinks that she pushed Louise out the window and that she murdered her is, you know, a piece of like the curtain, apparently, like from the window, she's still clutching in her hand. But B, she finds herself coming out of one of these drug-addled states outside of number 76. So she was like, oh my God, I was just inside Louise's flat. And then right after that, she's found dead. Of course, what happened there is that the numbers were switched on the door of Norma's own flat. So she was just outside of 67, which was made to look like 76. And, you know, they had been switched back, but that's why they were falling off, because they'd been fiddled with. And clearly someone is just being extremely cruel to poor Norma. She did not kill anyone. And I think we have a pretty good idea of who these two people involved are after going through our clues. But let's go on over into our resolution, Catherine.
I will
solve this.
know one last thing about that last clue is that, you know how sometimes we've mentioned that the really terrific Tom Adams covers of the Fontana books sometimes spoil things.
Yeah.
The 6 and the 7 are on the cover of the Fontana edition of this.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I don't think it spoils much because it's such a tiny little piece.
Yeah, no, of course. But we've joked about it before. I think in The Hollow, there's like the gun with the basket of eggs on the cover.
Yes.
I mean, they're like terrific. They're all like the best covers, but it's just funny how sometimes you're like, But yeah, I think we're pretty clear. Andrew Restorick is still missing or dead in Africa. He's not in England. So who is Andrew Restorick? Well, he's a dude named Robert Orwell.
Who we hear of as he's being revealed. Never heard his name before.
Nope. And
never will again.
And never will again. It happens. It's like a blink and you miss it. But apparently he was some guy who met Andrew Restorick in Africa, and he's acting as Andrew Restorick with his wife / girlfriend Mary, who obviously, although wait for it, I'm saying this with an entirely flat delivery. It's Frances in a wig. They're trying to hustle to take this massive estate. They're trying the sooner the better, and then they're going to leave England, right?
They're just engaging in a massive fraud here. They're doing everything they can to impersonate Andrew Restorick.
Right, and they've been the ones drugging Norma.
Right. Aside from just appearing and claiming to be Andrew Restorick, Robert Orwell and his partner in crime, Mary Restorick / Frances Carey, I suppose we should just say Frances Carey because that's who she actually is. They hired David Baker, aka the Peacock, to paint those fake earlier portraits of his first wife and of Robert Orwell as Andrew Restorick so that he could put it behind him. And, you know, it just allows him to assume greater authority because people will meet him and go, oh, clearly that's a portrait of him from like 30 years ago. It's in the style of 30 years ago. And that's obviously him because it's a younger version of him. So, of course, this is Andrew Restorick. Unfortunately, David Baker then decided to blackmail these two murderers, and that's never a smart idea, which is why he became the second victim. And why did they kill Louise Charpentier, Catherine?
Because she would have been an adult woman who would have recognized Andrew. You know, we've seen so many cases in Christie that we've complained about in the past where people don't recognize their former husbands. So it kind of seems like maybe she didn't have to be killed.
Right. Although she was trying to get in touch with him, right?
Yes, she
like
was.
Louise. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's this other, very hard to swallow coincidence where Mrs. Oliver happens upon a note that Louise Charpentier was writing to Andrew Restrick.
It falls out of like furniture that's being moved.
Oh boy. Yeah. So we know that she was trying to get in touch with him. So it was unavoidable. Like they couldn't avoid the Louise problem, which is why Frances pushed her. And then in switching the numbers and just plying Norma with drugs, they got her to believe that she had done it. And then they did the same thing with David Baker. And there is, a little bit of an extra clue on that front, because the blood that is on David Baker's chest, he's been stabbed. It's noted that it's all hard and congealed, and yet Norma was supposed to have killed him minutes earlier. So he had been killed earlier and his body, put there by Frances. And, then she had run out and then come back in after Norma had discovered the body. And so, yeah, this is a pretty dastardly plot on poor Norma Restrick impersonating her father, who she hadn't seen since she was 5 years old and had a lot of issues with too. And that's the other thing that also preoccupies this book. And I was not a huge fan of it. There is so much talk about Norma's daddy issues in this book. The only thing about it that's interesting to me is that there are two extended conversations that Poirot has with Andrew Restrick, who turns out to not be Andrew Restrick. He's, of course, Robert Orwell. What Poirot says to Andrew Restrick is, because the father left and the mother stayed, through a quirk of psychology, little Norma actually blamed the parent who remained. She blamed her mother, not her father, and then she idealized the father. And Poirot says, she said to herself something in the nature of, father was fond of me. It's mother he didn't like. And that is basically verbatim what Rosalind told Christie as a child after Archie left her. She actually said to her, well, he didn't like you. He likes me. That's why he left. He left because of you, not me. And this very much wounded her. And, she obviously remembered it all these years later, which is not surprising. It's interesting that I think that might actually go to explain the preoccupation in this book with Norma's daddy issues, which aren't that interesting on their face. I think maybe given the fact that she was thinking about Rosalind and her own situation, maybe she thought they were a little more interesting than I think they seem to be. I don't know. For me, that didn't really add all that much to Norma as a character or any of the intrigue or anything else. And there's a lot of space devoted to it in the book.
Yeah. And then also, speaking of daddy issues, she gets to get married off to Dr. Stillingfleet, her psychiatrist, who Papa Poirot has put her in an institution with. And Mrs. Oliver says, you knew, right, that they were going to then have a thing. And he was like, maybe.
Yeah,
wink, wink.
The final lines of the book are Mrs. Oliver calling him out on that, because they're also, not only is she getting married off to him, he's off to Australia. So she's setting sail within days and leaving England with him.
Yeah,
and
she's known the guy for a week, and he's her medical doctor as she's been going through a brutal series of psychological meltdowns.
He's basically her guardian. That's not problematic at all.
No.
Yeah, she says, they're talking about his qualifications. Did you send that girl to this particular doctor on purpose? Of course I did. His qualifications are, never mind his qualifications. You know what I mean. He and she. Did you? If you must know, yes. I thought so, said Mrs. Oliver. You do think of things, don't you? And that is the end of Third Girl.
Literally the end. That's the last line.
This episode is brought to you by Best Fiends.
Can I confess something to you, Kemper?
Call me Papa Poirot and stuff me in the priest's side of a confessional box. Always.
Well, despite the fact that I'm not super comfortable with that, Kemper, I will say that Howie the Lizard and I are still doing great. Of course, we're exercising our brains, solving cutely designed puzzles, and relaxing whenever we get a few minutes, because those slugs turn out to be quite challenging opponents.
Oh, I never doubted this. What's the problem?
Well, I sometimes worry. Don't all great things have to come to an end?
While I understand your anxiety on that score, Catherine, I think when it comes to Howie and Best Fiends, they just may be the exception that proves the rule. Because Best Fiends never ends. The levels go on, and the games are being constantly refreshed and updated on a regular basis. It's a virtual nirvana of casual game playing.
I mean, I really do feel like my lizard wizard companion and I can feel at peace now, Kemper. So, while I am not going to call you Papa Kemper, I will thank you.
I'm so glad that you feel at peace. And if you would like to feel at peace or just feel good, dear listener, as good as Catherine and Howie the Lizard, I urge you all to engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. Okay, so before we get into rankings, let's talk briefly about the one adaptation that we have for this novel.
The plot is very much changed.
Well, all of the daddy issues are excised from our Suchet version, which is interesting. And there are a lot of changes that have to be made because, of course, the biggest one is as to setting. And I think it's interesting that this is one of the Christies where setting is pretty important. I mean, this one really is set in the 60s, right? Like it's important almost to the solving of the mystery just because of the preoccupation with drugs, right? And just the prominence or like predominance of drugs in and around Chelsea and London in general. I think it's really hard to shoehorn this story into the 1930s, but the adaptation does do that.
In fairness, Peril at End House is actually very concerned about drugs.
It's concerned about drugs, but it's not concerned about the proliferation of drugs in general, which I think is kind of an important backdrop for why they're able to pull this off in terms of drugging someone, Right. And that's concerned about like drug taking by a specific set of people, right? I know what you mean.
It's art people in Peril at End House too, though.
It is, but there are like rich art people at this crumbling estate. Hey, it's doable, and they do pull it off. We should say, so this is, again, The Third Girl, and it was adapted in series/season 11. It's the third of 4 episodes from that series/season. It's 90 minutes long. This is when they were doing the individual features as adaptations. It aired in July of 2010. It opens up very much like the book, I mean, except for the fact that it's set in the 30s, but we get Norma Restrick coming in. We get Zoe Wanamaker as Mrs. Oliver. They dispense with the coincidence as to Poirot going to Mrs. Oliver. They also dispense with a lot of the comings and goings in the book and the logistical issues by just having Mrs. Oliver live in Borodin Mansions below the flat in question where these 3 young women live, which is also rather simplifying. It's fine. It's funny. Mark Aldridge in his book, Agatha Christie on Screen, I very much agree with his final word on it, which is that it seems that this is an example of where a Poirot adaptation appears to exist in order to complete the canon rather than because of any particular interest in the source material. A middling adaptation of a relatively weak book.
Yeah.
I think that might be a tad harsh. The only thing that I can say in its favor is that David Suchet himself actually talks about this in Poirot and Me, how he was pleased that the series was still able to attract major acting talent. And he praised in particular the actor who plays Norma Restrick. And she is good. She looks very much like Carla Gugino, which I found very distracting. But this is what he writes about it. The cast were absolutely terrific, but Jemima Rooper, the young actress playing the leading lady, Norma Restrick, particularly caught the eye. 2 years later, I was delighted to find her playing alongside me on the West End stage in Arthur Miller's great play, All My Sons. And he talks about that stage experience a little later in the book, because Zoe Wanamaker was actually also in the play, and how he really appreciated the companionship he got from both these actors, as his leading role of Joe Keller forced him to, spoiler alert, die off stage via suicide 8 times a week. And as Suchet put it, hardly the cheeriest of experiences for an actor. So I'm glad that Jemima Rooper and Zoe Wanamaker were able to help him through that trial in that Arthur Miller play, which is definitely a project. The only other thing that I would say about it, too, is that the actor playing the Peacock, playing David Baker, is Tom Meissen. And it's the 30s, so he has to have short hair. He can't have the long hair. It's just really funny and sort of ironic because that actor, Tom Meissen, a couple of years later would go on to play Ichabod Crane in Sleepy Hollow. that Fox series that, like, for a hot second, everyone watched. And kind of the reason everyone watched it is because he and his co-star were so charming together, but he had super long hair in it and he rocked it. Like, he looked so good.
Well, it was just because he was, like, kind of hot, and then he just always would be like, well, Lieutenant. Which I'm now revealing that I also was one of those people who watched.
No, everyone kind of was. It was very weird. Everyone was like, why are we all watching Sleepy Hollow right now?
It was kind of a lot. And I definitely stopped watching it before it ended, but I 100% watched, like, the first half of the first season at least.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I think I probably watched like 4 or 5 episodes, but, like, he and his long hair were the first and second reasons why I was watching. I just think it's funny that he played the peacock, but without long hair. They also changed the means of influencing Norma Restrick into making her think that she committed the murders. They're basically just preying upon her post-traumatic distress at having...
They're gaslighting her.
Yeah, well, it's like her mother had killed herself, and they're playing off of her guilt and just kind of her general psychosis resulting from that, which is, I understand why they didn't want to do the drug-addled thing, because we'll talk about it. It's pretty silly, and it doesn't really play in the novel, unfortunately, given that it's such a key component of the novel. But, like, I didn't find that all that convincing either. So that was a bit of a problem.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's fine. There is also a French language version from Les Petits Meurtres d'Agatha Christie. I did have someone write us and to let us know that this entire time, Catherine, you've been so busy making fun of my terrible accent whenever I say this French title that you haven't bothered to point out that I've been mispronouncing it this whole time too. Let's just say it right now. Oeuvre has 2 syllables. It's oeuvre. And meurtre also has 2 syllables. It's meurtre. So I just want to point that out. I am aware, everyone. I apologize for the accent. Catherine is just going to, laugh away in her corner over in her little hot box of an apartment right now. That's fine. You've had a tough week. I'll give it to you, but
thank you. I really do appreciate it. It's like my therapeutic gift. It's like you gave me a spa certificate that I can just bask in the cucumber eye mask of your acknowledgement of your terrible French.
Well, now you've been cheated out of a whole syllable. I'm just going to do it again for you. Les Petits Meurtres d'Agatha Christie. They adapted this as part of the second iteration of that series, which makes a lot of sense since that is very much set in the swinging 60s, the second iteration of that show. And that was in 2017. The title was Crime Haute Couture. Love it. All right, Catherine, let's talk about the rankings for this book. We'll start with plot mechanics. And as we so often do, we are going to start with a quote from our good friend John Curran. Here is what he had to say about Third Girl. Like some other novels from Christie's last decade, Third Girl is wordy. There are many passages and indeed chapters which could and arguably should have been omitted, such as the detailed description of long basing, chapter 4, and much of Mrs. Oliver's trudge around London, chapter 9. The plot itself, despite its promising beginning, requires a considerable suspension of disbelief, while the swinging 60s background is largely unconvincing. The impersonation disclosed in the final explanation is difficult to accept, calling into question the entire basis of the novel. Third Girl is the weakest book of the 1960s. Personally, and I think given my distaste for repetition, I think if I had to pinpoint a book from the 60s that's the weakest, as of now, we haven't read all the books from the 60s yet, I would say that's The Clocks, actually. I prefer this book to The Clocks. I maybe prefer this book to At Bertram's Hotel, even. So I'm not saying this is a good book, but
kind of with you on both counts. It's unfortunate. I was actually kind of, I feel like I said this about At Bertram's Hotel too, but like I was kind of like, oh, I don't really entirely remember this or At Bertram's Hotel, and I was like kind of excited about it, and then I read it and was like, oh, okay.
I think we definitely had a case of high expectations being disappointed when we read At Bertram's Hotel. I didn't remember Third Girl almost at all, except for like the concept of a third girl. But I think I was assuming it was not going to be great because I knew that it was a late 60s Poirot. And like, let's be honest, they get pretty hairy from here on out, sort of. So I maybe was pleasantly surprised by that. So maybe I had lower expectations, and that also partially accounts for it. But I'm not going to sit here and say that this book is great Christie and that it should be in the top third or anything like that. But I definitely enjoyed it more than The Clocks, and I'm pretty sure I enjoyed it more than At Bertram's Hotel overall. And I think that when we're talking about plot mechanics specifically, again, I stand by the fact that even though this is a loosely told, a wordy, baggy puzzle mystery, we do have a puzzle mystery here. I mean, we have lots of clues, and there are lots of old Christie standbys, and I enjoyed that as I was reading and as I was thinking about the mystery, even though the overall context for it, which we'll get to when we get to tone and setting, and I think book-specific characters, none of that is working. Like, almost nothing about the characters in this book and the setting of this book, and in some ways even the tone of this book, because of how loosely it's told, almost none of that is working. But I think that the plot as to mechanics and credibility, while not great, is okay.
Yeah. Where are you landing?
I think you could make an argument for anywhere between a 4 to a 6 for both of these categories. I think that
split the difference and go with a 5.
I think, let's split the difference and go with 5s for both of them. The only thing I want to point out as to plot credibility, we've talked about all of the issues when it comes to mechanics already, is that it's interesting to me that Norma being drugged here, and Curran talks about this actually, is very similar to what happens to Molly Kendall in A Caribbean Mystery and Hugh Chandler in The Cretan Bull, which is within the Labors of Hercules. We talked about that when we covered A Caribbean Mystery. But unlike those instances, it's really hard to believe it here. And again, I think that just has to do with the geriatric paranoia over drugs. And it's not like she can't convincingly have a character out of his or her mind on drugs. She did it when there wasn't all this hoo-ha as to Purple Hearts and Emerald Dreams and hemp. I mean, this is what she says about hemp. Hemp distorting the time factor so that she might believe an experience has lasted an hour instead of a few minutes, and a good many other curious substances. I mean, oh boy, so we're supposed to think that smoking a little weed is going to make her be like, oh, what just happened? Is this 7? I mean, this is where we're living in such a different world right now compared to the one that Christie lived in. I mean, this is a world where certainly hemp is, it's a hard sell that Norma is made to believe she's a murderer. I couldn't find anything on Emerald Dreams, which to me sounds like the pill form of those poppies that like Dorothy and everyone eats.
Oh yeah,
Wizard
sure.
of Oz, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But Purple Hearts, apparently, they were commonly prescribed to women for anxiety and as a dietary aid. And in the early to mid 60s, they could be obtained from dealers at nightclubs and were used by many mods as a stimulant to keep them going through their all-night dancing sessions. So apparently she was really on point. I mean, to me, it sounds like the Purple Heart's an upper and then the Emerald Dream is a downer. Right, that you take after when you need to go to bed at like 5 in the morning or something. I don't know.
We're recording this at night, and I'm like, this is past my bedtime. So the idea of doing that is like, I'm too old for that, Kemper.
I don't need any downers anymore. But just the other point on plot credibility, which I think is interesting, and John Curran touches on it, does have to do with the impersonation in this novel, because this is such a Christie trope, right? And I think it's worth parsing for a second. So fast forward if you haven't yet read Lord Edgeworth Dies, 3-Act Tragedy, After the Funeral, or Traitor Hands / The Witness for the Prosecution. But here's what John Curran has to say on that score. It is difficult for the reader to believe that even in Norma's drug-induced twilight existence, the same person could have been accepted as her flatmate and her stepmother. Impersonation has frequently played an important part in Christie's fiction. Carlotta Adams in Lord Edgeworth Dies, Sir Charles Cartwright in 3-Act Tragedy, Miss Gilchrist in After the Funeral, Romaine in Witness for the Prosecution. But in each of these cases, the impersonation is a one-off episode and not a long-term arrangement. And in 3 of these instances, the impersonator is a professional actor. And, hey, she went to RADA, so Frances is an actor in my book, but it's a good point. This is a long con that is played out in full sunlight. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to believe.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think we're being kind with a 5 for credibility, but let's be kind. I think that 10 out of 20 overall is about where this belongs. And then I think we're very happily going to get to the best category for this book, which is series-long characters. I mean, as we mentioned, we have a ton of them here. So of course we have Poirot, of course we have Ariadne Oliver, but I think this book really is remarkable for just how many other series-long characters we have. And by my count, there are 6. And I think we've mentioned all of them at this point. No, with one
Miss
glaring
Lemon.
exception. Yeah. So we've got Chief Inspector Neal, Mr. Goby, Dr. Stillingfleet, George the valet, Colonel Race, who just gets a name check, and then Miss Lemon. And, you know, many of these characters' connection, I think, to their other appearances is tenuous at best. We talked about that with Chief Inspector Neal and also with Dr. Stillingfleet. But I think Miss Lemon, actually, we should just pause on for a second because she's delightful, as she always is, or at least actually isn't always in the books, but sometimes is in the books. And this is kind of a good Miss Lemon book because she has a few good moments. And I especially appreciated this exchange between her and Poirot, which I think that Miranda Priestley of Runway Magazine would also really appreciate. Because here's what they say to each other. "I can always rely on you, Miss Lemon," he said. "C'est fantastique." "Really, Monsieur Poirot, I cannot see anything fantastic about it. You gave me instructions and I carried them out. Naturally." "Pah, it is not so natural as that," said Poirot. "Do I not give instructions often to the gasmen, the electricians, the man who comes to repair things, and do they always carry out my instructions? Very, very seldom." I mean, Miss Lemon does her job. Miranda Priestley wishes that she could have Miss Lemon as her assistant. I'm just saying.
Right. Yeah, the series long characters are all good. And we've quoted like every good Ariadne Oliver and Poirot line at this point. So I don't think we need to dwell on that.
Catherine? Have we quoted all of them?
I don't know. How much do you want me to kill you?
No, I actually think you're totally right. We have absolutely touched on all of the good moments. They make me so very, very happy. I also just really appreciated that it's Mrs. Oliver who gets conked on the head. And, you know, that also adds to the joy of this book. Love when someone gets bashed over the head in Christie. Oh, well, the only thing that I did think was really funny is that she says at some point that she's written 43 novels. And in The Pale Horse, she says that she's written 55 novels at least. And
well, also, though, I would totally think of her as somebody who would just completely misremember the number of novels that she's written.
Oh, no, I'm really not sure if this is another continuity error or if it's just Christie making fun of Mrs. Oliver for not knowing how many novels she's written. And like, let's give Christie the benefit of the doubt, as we always do, because that's really funny. And by the way, Christie herself, by this point, had written 56 novels, and that doesn't even include her short story collections or her non-mystery novels. So, you know, she's not doing too badly. And the only other thing as to continuity is that we almost get a reference to Miss Bulstrode's beloved Meadowbank School when we go to visit Meadowfield Girls' School, and there's that interview with the headmistress, and that just could have been a great opportunity to hear from Miss Bulstrode. So I was a little disappointed by that. But despite my disappointment, I think that we just have so many great appearances from these characters that we have to go fairly high for this category. And I insist on a 7 at least.
I'm with you.
Okay. 7 for series-long characters. Then we get into book-specific characters. We talked a lot about this as well. I think that, again, Norma Restorick and David Baker, they're not the murderers. So the distance that we feel from them and the haziness, the fuzziness of them as characters is truly problematic and I think truly damning when it comes to the quality of characters in this book, because Norma in some ways is the main victim, even though she's not a murder victim, and David is our late murder victim and very prominent in the book. But they both, again, are drawn with specificity as to their physicality, but when it comes to who they are, it to me really just feels like they're these types that Christie had fixated on for several years and decided to bring to the forefront in a book, but that still does not a good character make. And
they don't they don't have any personalities.
Yeah, they are what they look like. And, you know, we get a lot of, I think, amusing reactions to especially David Baker. And I did appreciate that Sir Roderick, he says, they're all alike nowadays, long-haired young fellows, beatniks, beetles, all sorts of names they've got. I can't keep up with them, practically talk a foreign language. I feel like Jack Kerouac is rolling over in his grave at the conflation of beatniks and beetles there. But hey, we just got a reference to the Beatles in Agatha Christie, so we are officially in the 60s. It's a rollicking good time. And the only other thing as to David, which I thought was really curious, is that at one point Mrs. Oliver is explaining the Peacock nickname to him. And maybe this is just my dirty mind, but I know you too have a dirty mind, Catherine.
I do.
And she says, vain, I should think, proud of his looks. Perhaps a lot of other things as well. Is that a reference to his tight trousers? They make a point of his skin-tight trousers a lot. Like, what else is he proud of?
His art. Well, clearly he's a pretty good art forger.
Yeah.
I didn't actually read it. Like, I'm like really a giant perv, and I did not
think of that.
No, I did not. But you know, I kind of like that. That seems like
just like imagining him in these like velvet breeches, like strutting about. And he's called the Peacock. I don't know. Anyway, and then Sir Roderick is also just such a type. I mean, my God, he is the older retired military man.
Yeah,
Christie. It's about as stock as you can get at this point. And then Sonia too. And this is where also, I mean, the espionage subplot, which, to be fair, Christie even has Mrs. Oliver say at some point, like, oh God, this isn't all going to come down to espionage, is it? And it doesn't, but it's just like, there's this whole thing where we think that she stole these papers of Sir Roderick's, and then they turn up at the end of the book, and it's like, oh, well, I guess even though she was...
Well, then they get married.
Yeah, like, I guess even though she had that sort of weird interaction with a junior attaché at the Herzegovinian embassy, that she's not really a spy, and they were going to get married, and she's legit. I mean, this could just be a long con. How does Poirot know that she's legit?
She doesn't have a last name even, and we don't know what country she's from. So, I mean, it's like one of those things where it's like, why is she even in here? Why do I care?
I know. I think we have to go pretty low on the characters. I actually think that we can't do any higher than a 4. And I think a 4 is probably being kind. But Christie has certainly done worse also. Like, this isn't the lowest of the low, but it's not great.
Okay, we'll do 4.
Okay. All right. And then we get to setting and tone, which we've already prepared you all is not going to score all that well, and certainly not as well as it usually does. You know, this book is unequivocally set in the 60s. At one point, we're told that the first Mrs. Restorick died in April of 1963. So there's no question that we're in the 60s here. And the setting is supposed to evoke swinging London, and it neither evokes London nor the swinging part, I think. You know, the most I can say for it is that Christie was in part basing Borodine Mansions on a flat that she kept in London for much of her life in Swan's Court. And for a while, she had wanted to do something that played on the idea of those flats being interchangeable. Because we even get this whole thing about how there's like a giant Harlequin, shades of Harley Quinn, like on the wall of their flat, and how that was one of the pieces of art that you could use. And like the numbers that they're switching on the door, you know, she's trying to play around with the idea of the flats being interchangeable. But
did you really like the wood paneled wallpaper?
Yeah, there's the wallpaper that looks like wood. She evokes the flat, I suppose, specifically. And again, like, then not surprising that she lived in a flat similar to this herself. Apparently, by the way, someone really did jump out of a window and kill themselves in Swan's Court. And that was somewhat of an inspiration, or at least a catalyst for writing this novel. So that's interesting. But that's really the most I can say for the setting. We've seen Christie evoke London a lot better than this. Sometimes in her novel set in London, she doesn't really bother to evoke London. Here she did, but again, she doesn't necessarily do it that well. I think we should acknowledge, though, that a lot of other Christie scholars disagree with us here. You know, Janet Morgan is actually very forgiving and even admiring of the London setting that Christie paints in this book. And she, you know, very much focuses, I think, on the Swan's Court of it all. But, you know, she says how this is sort of evoking the parts of London where she had lived for years, smart streets that suddenly gave onto extraordinary avenues lined with boutiques and ephemeral restaurants, thoroughfares crowded with oddly dressed people, some deliberately scruffy, others ultra theatrical, all apparently aged about 17. I just wasn't that convinced by it. Laura Thompson also really liked it, and she said, Third Girl is set in swinging London, the city of beatniks, casual sex and drugs, girls like unattractive Ophelias and boys like beautiful Van Dykes. And then she quotes Edmund Cork writing to Christie in August 1966, your editor is amazed at the way you have got the young people. Thompson goes on to say, Agatha wrote much of the book in the strong, clear voice of Ariadne Oliver. In fact, she now used a dictaphone, and in Third Girl, this worked to her advantage. Mrs. Oliver is openly intrigued by fashionable London, and her thought processes, which are a simplified version of Agatha's own, bring the milieu to life. For example, and this is the one part of her analysis I do agree with. For example, she shadows a young man, the Peacock as she calls him, to a ramshackle painter's studio in Chelsea. The scene is utterly convincing, as are the three people that Mrs. Oliver finds there, who treat her with a typically youthful mixture of matyness, lack of respect, and slight menace. Mrs. Oliver is teetotal, like Agatha, and refuses a drink when it is offered. The lady doesn't drink, says the Peacock. Who would have thought it? And then Laura Thompson goes on to rhapsodize about Endless Night, which, to be fair, is Christie doing it well? So I wanted to quote that because I think there are people for whom this book works a lot better than I think it did for either of us.
Yeah, I guess good on them.
This is actually a fascinating tidbit, but per Mark Aldridge, yet again, who's just the font of information, as he always is on this book, he wrote, luckily for Collins's lawyers, a further complaint about the tastes of the youth was removed before publication of this book, in which the author described Coca-Cola as an abomination. So we're at least saved a Coca-Cola tangent in this book, apparently. The only other thing I want to mention, because I think it's one of these cases where a contemporary read of the book would have differed significantly from our read in 2021. There's this throwaway section, admittedly, in which Sir Roderick is mentioning a bunch of former military personalities who have written memoirs. And he says all the chaps are doing it nowadays. And these other memoirs are his inspiration for writing his own book, which we're pretty sure is going to be absolutely terrible. Mm-hmm. And the names he reels off, though, they seem fake. And I assumed they were fake. And then I was like, you know what? I'll do a Google. Just make sure that, that these are made up names. They are very much not made up. All of the names that he mentions are the names of military personages from the Second World War. They are very real people, and they wrote extremely dishy and fascinating memoirs. And I think that these references, just this whole passage would have been so much more entertaining when the book was first published. It's really funny because all the people he mentions too, one of them, he says Montgomery, who's Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. He counted Churchill as a faithful friend, and Churchill's final word on him is that in defeat, unbeatable, in victory, unbearable. So apparently Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery was quite a character. Then Alan Brooke is Field Marshal Alan Francis Brooke, whose diaries were infamous mainly for their criticisms of Churchill. Then we have Auchinleck, which is Cloud Auchinleck, or maybe Auchinleck, another British Army commander who served in India and also during the Second World War. And then the last one is really fascinating, and that's Morin, actually Lord Morin, whose birth name was Charles Wilson. And he was Churchill's private physician from 1940 until Churchill's death in 1965, which had just happened. And apparently in 1966, he published his memoirs on both sides of the pond, and the response was immediate and highly critical. Churchill's family and his immediate political entourage were outraged by these memoirs because apparently they considered that the revealing of information by his personal doctor was just a total breach of medical ethics. So it was very much like a cause celeb sort of thing. And it's just interesting to me that what seems like a random sort of paragraph actually probably would have been extremely entertaining and interesting to a reader in 1967. So I just wanted to point that out. I know Catherine really appreciated that.
So much, Kemper.
So before we rank this, my final point, I promise, Catherine, is actually something that Caroline Crampton on our sister podcast, She Done It, which I know many of you listen to. We, of course, listen, and we love it. Lots of crossover love here between the two podcasts, the two mystery-obsessed podcasts. She recently made a really interesting point that actually had to do with Third Girl, and I think it's worth bringing up because it also speaks to the strength of this novel, actually. In a recent episode, she compared the young, unmarried Norma Restorick in Third Girl to the young, unmarried Cynthia Murdoch in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. The one who works in a dispensary, right, as Agatha Christie did during World War I. Cynthia is truly an Edwardian young lady in that book, right? Mm-hmm. That book was written in like 1916. Just for a second, let's just take a moment to compare Cynthia and Norma. as young women of their time. We make this point so many times, but Christie really did change with the times. Poirot himself even points out that, Norma as a single young woman, when she disappears and her friends and family have no idea where she is, he's like, well, that's not really a cause for concern on its face. It's more that she seemed drugged out of her mind, that we should be concerned. That is not how he would have reacted if Cynthia Murdoch all of a sudden disappeared. That would have been oh my God, we need to go find and save this defenseless young woman. Let's comb the woods. So it's just really interesting that Christie's come a long way. And even though she didn't capture swinging London, she is at least portraying people who are recognizable and believable on a base level in 1966/67. And given that she's someone who's been getting published since 1920, that's quite a feat. So I just want to point that out as we give a rather low score to the setting and tone. And of course, the tone did not really work for us since this was not one of the breezier Christies. We found it a little difficult to get through. I think we've got to go pretty low on this, Catherine, right?
Yeah, I think so. The Mrs. Oliver stuff is all pretty great. But I mean, outside of that, yeah, I think you have to go pretty low.
So where do you come out?
I guess a 4 or 5.
Yeah, I think we should do a 4. 4 is what I was feeling. It pains me.
Yeah,
we haven't done that low in a while.
No, and I might reevaluate that. I really do think the Mrs. Oliver stuff is good, and I really do think just based on that, you might be able to go up to a 5. But yeah, 4 is fine.
Okay. And then, happily, I think the depictions stuck in their time category is going to be pretty fast because we have Poirot being a bit sexist at times, but he's a character, and at this point, he's a crotchety old man. That's very much in keeping with his character. We have a lot of other characters being sexist. Again, Inspector Neil, Andrew Restorick, even George gets in on the action, but those are all characters. I don't think we're going to sit here and accuse Christie herself of being sexist. There is this sequence in which Mrs. Oliver questions the daily cleaning woman at Bordine Mansions, which I found to be a little surprisingly demeaning to that woman. She's called Mrs. Mop.
Yeah.
At one point, given Christie's career-long reminder to her readers never to underestimate the help. That cleaning woman also displayed, I think, some troubling opinions as to mental illness. But again, that is a character that Christie created.
Also, did you notice how everybody just gets let into the apartments?
They're all just kind of sailing through.
They're like, hey, I want to go into this random person's apartment. I'm not going to give you any reason or identification.
Right. Yeah. Any time of day or night, they're just like, hey neighbor, or not. Yeah. It's weird. I think, maybe there's a little bit of xenophobia in the portrayal of Sonia, but it's slight and it certainly does not overwhelm the book. I think that we can get away with 0 deductions.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well, we have come to the portion of the episode when we tally up our scores for this story. We have, for Third Girl, a 5 plus 5 plus 7 plus 4 plus 4 minus 0 for a grand total of 25 points, putting Third Girl in a tie at 40th or 41st place with The Mysterious Affair at Styles and Murder in Mesopotamia. So this is putting it in the lower third, which is where I think it belongs.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I think it goes below those.
I think it certainly goes below The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And I think that I agree that it goes below Murder in Mesopotamia, which is deeply flawed, but has a lot going for it. I'll just note, if you're in agreement then, that we're going to put it below those two.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'll just note then that we're putting Third Girl in 42nd place of 57 titles, and it is just above The Moving Finger. And we talked about this on our previous novel episode.
We have to move it.
It's too low. There's actually, I think, going to be a bit of rejiggering as to the titles in and around here.
We're going to be moving our fingers, as it were, with some of these rankings.
That title is going to earn itself, I think, by moving around a lot in our rankings. But yeah, it's all these titles that I think are sitting at the top of the bottom third that are a little mixed up and jumbled right now, but not too much. They're all in the right general area. I think we just have a little bit of rearranging to do. So for now, Third Girl sits at 42nd place of 57 novels. Catherine, I mean, after the length of this episode, you might be pleased to hear this, but we are now officially in single digits as to the number of books we have left. We have 9 titles left.
That's going to give me very bad anxiety, I think.
All right, well, that is Third Girl. I'm not going to say that I wished I liked it more than I did, because I actually think I liked it just the right amount. I think there actually was a lot to appreciate about this not so great, relatively speaking always, Christie mystery.
Yeah, I thought I was going to like it more, frankly. I feel much less bad about this than I did about At Bertram's Hotel.
Yes, agreed. So that is Third Girl. Join us in our next episode for yet another Poirot short story. We still have some more to cover. Always an exciting episode when we can do some short form Poirot. This time we will be covering The Underdog.
Interesting. You mean the titular story of The Underdog and Other Stories?
I do indeed.
Oh,
the
very
titular
exciting.
Underdog. Some of you have commented on how often we like to use the word titular, so we'll be using it a whole bunch in that episode, apparently. Or I could use eponymous, I suppose. We'll just be using eponymous and titular left and right. So that is next time, and then we'll be doing a novel episode after that, which will be Endless Night. We are very excited for that one.
Excited about, yes.
And, quite honestly, perhaps that will break into our top 10. There's a chance that it could. It's been forever since I've read it, but I know that it's excellent. One of the few shining jewels we have left in the Christie crown. I have hopes that it will do very well, at the very least.
I do too. I mean, and it's always exciting when we got ones that show up really high.
Absolutely. So join us for that. And in the meantime, if you would like to hear more from us, you can always subscribe to our Patreon account. Visit us over at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. You can email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine on Twitter at Brobcat. Our Instagram handle is at allaboutagatha. And please take a moment to rate and review us if you haven't already done so. It really helps us out. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.